It started like any other day. I came home from work a little earlier than usual, a bouquet of flowers in hand, planning to surprise Emily. She'd been distant lately, and I thought maybe a small gesture could help bridge the gap that had slowly grown between us. I didn't expect much, just a smile, a thank you, perhaps a small step back toward the connection we once shared. As I opened the door, I noticed the faint hum of music coming from upstairs. Odd, since Emily rarely played music at home anymore. My footsteps were quiet, unintentional but cautious, as I climbed the stairs. A voice, familiar, low, and unmistakable, drifted through the partially open door of our bedroom. It was Ethan's voice, my younger brother. My stomach twisted, a sickening knot of confusion and dread. I pushed the door open, and the sight before me was like a physical blow. Emily and Ethan were in our bed, tangled together, their betrayal laid bare in an instant. They froze, their faces masks of shock and guilt. "Caleb," Emily started, her voice weak and trembling. I didn't let her finish. "Don't," I said, my voice low but steady, though it took every ounce of strength to keep it that way. "Don't say another word." Ethan scrambled for his clothes, mumbling incoherent excuses. It's not what it looks like." I laughed bitterly. "Not what it looks like. You're in my bed with my wife. What else could it be?" Neither of them had an answer. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. I walked out of the room without another word, their voices chasing me down the hall as they tried to explain, to justify the unjustifiable. I didn't care. There was nothing they could say that would undo what I'd just seen. That night, I slept in my car. I couldn't bear to stay in the house, surrounded by the memories of a life that now felt like a cruel joke. The next morning, I filed for divorce. There was no discussion, no attempt at reconciliation. Emily tried to reach out, leaving tearful voicemails and sending long, apologetic emails, but I ignored them all. The betrayal was too deep, the wounds too fresh. Ethan, predictably, showed no remorse. He didn't bother to apologize or explain himself. In fact, he seemed almost defiant, as if he believed he'd done nothing wrong. That only solidified my decision to sever ties with him, and with the rest of my family, who seemed intent on minimizing the situation. "Families fight," my mother said when I told her I was cutting off contact. "You need to forgive each other. Ethan's your brother, and Emily, well, people make mistakes." Mistakes? That was the word she chose to describe what they had done? It was clear they weren't going to take my side, and I wasn't going to stick around to listen to them justify Ethan and Emily's actions. I packed what little I could carry and left. The house, the memories, the life I had built. It was all tainted now. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. As I drove away, the weight of everything settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The two people I had trusted most in the world had betrayed me in the worst way imaginable. My marriage was over, my family ties shattered, and I was completely alone. But even in the midst of that overwhelming pain, there was a tiny ember of resolve. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let them break me. Leaving behind everything I knew was like walking away from the life I'd built brick by brick with my own hands. But staying meant being suffocated by the weight of betrayal. So I packed my car, turned the key, and drove until the familiar streets of my hometown were nothing more than a blur in my rearview mirror. I ended up in a modest apartment in a new city, a clean slate, or so I hoped. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, but it was mine. A space free from the shadows of Ethan and Emily. The first few nights were the hardest, the silence deafening. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying that moment in the bedroom over and over. Their faces, the shock, the guilt. It haunted me like a broken record I couldn't turn off. The anger came in waves, often followed by crushing sadness. I couldn't decide which was worse. Rachel, my therapist, became a lifeline. I was reluctant at first, but I knew I couldn't do this alone. On my second session, she said something that stuck with me. "Caleb, healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about reclaiming your narrative. Your life isn't defined by their betrayal. It's defined by how you move forward." I carried those words with me, repeating them like a mantra on the days when the weight of it all felt too much. Work became my distraction. I threw myself into it, taking on extra projects and responsibilities to fill the hours. My colleagues noticed the change in me, but they didn't pry. For that, I was grateful. The last thing I needed was pity. Over time, I started to build a routine. I'd wake up early, go for a run to clear my mind, and then spend the day at work. Evenings were for myself, reading, cooking, or losing myself in a good movie. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I began meeting people, too. Slowly, cautiously. There was James, the guy who lived down the hall, and invited me over for beers one evening. And Linda, a coworker who introduced me to her group of friends at a casual Friday night dinner. New guy, huh? One of them teased when I joined their table. New start, I corrected, offering a small smile. It was refreshing to be around people who didn't know my story. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. There were setbacks, of course. Nights when I'd find myself scrolling through old photos, my chest tightening as I stared at the life I'd left behind. Or when a random song on the radio would bring back a memory I wasn't ready to face. But those moments became less frequent as the days turned into weeks, then months. One evening, after a particularly grueling day at work, I stopped at a cafe for a coffee. The barista handed me my cup with a smile, and I noticed the quote printed on the sleeve. Sometimes, you have to let go of the life you plan to make room for the life that's waiting for you. It felt like the universe was sending me a message. By the time I walked back to my apartment that night, I realized something had shifted. The pain was still there, but it wasn't all-consuming anymore. For the first time, I could see a glimmer of hope, a small but steady light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to live. It started with a book. I was wandering through a small bookstore on a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind of place that felt like stepping back in time. Wooden shelves lined the walls, the air thick with the comforting scent of aged paper. I hadn't been looking for anything in particular, just a distraction from the thoughts that often lingered too long in my mind. As I browsed the shelves, my fingers grazing the spines, a soft voice broke through my thoughts. Looking for something specific, or just browsing? I turned and saw her. Rachel. She was standing behind the counter, her auburn hair tied back in a loose bun, a warm smile on her face. Just browsing, I replied, suddenly aware of how out of place I must have looked, unkempt after my morning run, wearing an old hoodie and sneakers. Well, let me know if you need any recommendations, she said, her tone genuine. I nodded and returned to the shelves, but something about her lingered in my mind. There was a kindness in her eyes, a quiet warmth that felt oddly disarming. I ended up buying a book I didn't really need, more as an excuse to talk to her again than anything else. As she rang up my purchase, we exchanged a few pleasantries, small talk about the weather, the shop's history, and how she'd come to own it. Books are kind of my safe space, she admitted with a laugh. They've gotten me through some tough times. I smiled, not ready to share my own story but appreciating the openness in hers. Over the next few weeks, I found myself returning to the bookstore more often than I cared to admit. Sometimes I'd buy something, other times I'd just browse and chat with Rachel if she wasn't busy. Our conversations were light at first, revolving around books and the occasional shared laugh over a quirky customer. But slowly, I began to let my guard down. One evening, as the shop was about to close, she asked me about the book I'd bought on my first visit. Did you enjoy it? She asked, leaning on the counter. I hesitated, then shrugged. Honestly, I haven't gotten around to reading it yet. I guess I bought it more for the company than the content. Her cheeks flushed slightly, and she gave me a shy smile. Well, I guess that makes me the recommendation. That was the moment something shifted. We started spending more time together outside the shop, coffee here, a walk in the park there. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but something far better. A steady, unspoken understanding. Rachel wasn't the type to rush things, and I wasn't ready to jump headfirst into anything. Still, her presence became a bright spot in my life. Rachel had a way of making even the simplest moments feel significant. She listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and never pressed me to share more than I was ready to. One evening, as we sat on a bench overlooking the city skyline, She turned to me and said, "You know, Caleb, you're allowed to let yourself be happy again." The words hit me harder than I expected. I had spent so long clinging to the pain, letting it define me, that I hadn't even considered the possibility of something better. "Sometimes it doesn't feel that simple," I admitted. "I'm not saying it's simple," she replied, "but it's possible. And from what I can see, you deserve it." It wasn't a grand declaration of love or some sweeping romantic gesture, but it was exactly what I needed to hear. Over time, Rachel became more than just a friend. She became someone I could trust, someone who made me believe in the possibility of love again. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the scars of my past threatened to pull me back. But Rachel was patient, always reminding me that healing wasn't a straight line. Her bookstore became a second home for me, a place where I could escape the chaos of the world and just be. I even started helping out on weekends, organizing shelves, and chatting with customers. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that I hadn't thought possible. And as I stood behind the counter one evening, watching Rachel laugh with a customer, I realized something. I wasn't just moving forward. I was building something new, something real. 9 months had passed since I left the wreckage of my old life behind. Time had softened some of the edges, and with Rachel's steady presence, I'd begun to find a version of myself I could respect again. I had moved forward, or so I thought. Then, one day, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was innocuous at first glance, blending in with the usual bills and advertisements. But as soon as I saw the handwriting, my stomach twisted into a knot. It was my mother's. I hesitated before opening it, as if delaying the inevitable could somehow lessen its impact. Finally, I tore it open and pulled out the contents. Inside was a wedding invitation. Emily and Ethan. The names stared back at me, bold and unapologetic, as though they were mocking me. Beneath the printed invitation was a handwritten note from my parents. "Caleb, it's time to move on and heal as a family. We hope you'll join us for this joyous occasion. Let's put the past behind us and start fresh. Love, Mom and Dad." I stood frozen, the letter trembling in my hands. Joyous occasion? Heal as a family? The audacity of it all was staggering. Did they really expect me to celebrate the marriage of my ex-wife and my brother? The two people who had shattered my life? My blood boiled as the familiar waves of betrayal and anger came crashing back. 9 months of progress, undone in an instant. Rachel found me sitting on the couch later that evening, the invitation still clutched in my hand. She placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "What's that?" she asked softly. I handed her the envelope without a word. She read it quickly, her face darkening as she pieced it together. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice laced with disbelief. I shook my head, bitterness seeping into my tone. Apparently, it's time for me to move on as a family. Rachel sat down beside me, her expression a mix of anger and concern. "Caleb, you don't owe them anything. Not your presence, not your forgiveness, nothing." "I know," I said, though part of me still wrestled with guilt. They were my family, after all. But what kind of family turns a blind eye to betrayal and expects me to do the same? For the next few days, the invitation haunted me. I couldn't throw it away, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it either. It sat on the kitchen counter like a weight I couldn't shake. Rachel's support during that time was unwavering. She didn't push me to talk about it, but was always there when I needed her. One evening, as we closed up the bookstore together, she finally said, "You've come so far, Caleb. Don't let them pull you back into their dysfunction. You deserve better." Her words gave me the clarity I needed. I wrote a short, curt response to my parents, making it clear that I would not be attending the wedding. "I'm not interested in celebrating a union built on betrayal," I wrote. "You can have your fresh start without me." I sent the letter and blocked their numbers, unwilling to subject myself to their inevitable guilt tripping. For the first time since receiving the invitation, I felt a sense of relief. Rachel was waiting for me when I got home that evening. I told her what I'd done, and she smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "I knew you'd make the right choice," she said. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The past might resurface from time to time, but it didn't define me. I had a life here, a new beginning with Rachel and the community we were building together. The wedding invitation had been a test, and I had passed. Years passed, and the wounds left by Emily and Ethan's betrayal had mostly scarred over. My life was full now, with Rachel and the community we'd built together becoming the anchors I didn't realize I needed. The bookstore was thriving, and Emma had found joy in her role as its heart and soul. For the first time in a long while, I could say I was happy. But life has a cruel way of testing your resolve just when you think you've moved on. It was a quiet Saturday morning. Rachel was hosting a book club at the store, and I had just finished making coffee for the group when the doorbell at home rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, I debated ignoring it. But the persistent knocking pulled me toward the door. When I opened it, I froze. Ethan. His appearance was startling. He looked thinner, his hair unkempt, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He carried none of the arrogance I remembered. The smirk that once seemed permanently etched on his face replaced by something else, regret, or perhaps desperation. "Caleb," he said, his voice hoarse. "Can we talk?" I didn't move, gripping the doorframe to steady myself. Seeing him standing there brought back a flood of memories, each one more painful than the last. "What the hell are you doing here?" I asked, my tone cold. He shifted uncomfortably, looking down at the ground. "I know I'm the last person you want to see, but I need to talk to you. Please." I wanted to slam the door in his face, to tell him to crawl back to the mess he'd created. But a part of me, whether out of curiosity or a lingering sense of duty, stepped aside and let him in. He sat awkwardly on the couch, his hands fidgeting in his lap. I stood across from him, arms crossed, waiting for him to speak. "It's about Emily," he said finally. The sound of her name made my chest tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. "What about her?" "She's been unfaithful," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "Unfaithful? That's rich coming from you." He flinched but didn't argue. "I know I deserve that. I know I have no right to be here, asking for anything, but I thought you should know." "Know what?" I snapped. "That the woman you betrayed me with is now betraying you? That's not news, Ethan. That's karma." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading. "I made a mistake, Caleb. A horrible mistake. And I've paid for it every day since. She's been seeing other men. Multiple men. I thought we could build something real, but it was all a lie." I stared at him, incredulous. "And you came here why? For sympathy? For forgiveness? You destroyed my life, Ethan. You and Emily took everything from me. Why the hell would I care about your problems now?" "I don't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I guess I just needed to say I'm sorry. For everything. I've been carrying this guilt for years, and it's eating me alive." His words hung in the air, heavy with a sincerity I hadn't expected. But they didn't change anything. "You think saying sorry erases what you did?" I asked, my voice sharp. "You think it makes up for the years I spent rebuilding my life from the ashes you left behind?" "Newsflash, Ethan. I don't care about your guilt. That's your burden to bear, not mine." He bowed his head, his shoulders slumping. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Get out," I said, my voice steady. Ethan looked up at me, his eyes desperate. "Caleb." I said get out, I repeated, pointing to the door. "I don't want your apologies, and I don't want you in my life. Go back to whatever mess you've made for yourself, and leave me out of it." He stood slowly, his movements heavy with defeat. Without another word, he walked to the door and let himself out. I stood there for a long time after he left, my thoughts swirling. Seeing Ethan again had stirred up emotions I thought I'd buried. But instead of anger or sadness, I felt something else, relief. I had faced him, the man who had once turned my life upside down, and come out stronger. His pain was no longer my pain. His guilt was no longer my responsibility. That evening, Rachel found me sitting on the back porch, staring at the stars. She sat beside me, her presence grounding me as always. "Ethan came by," I said after a long silence. She didn't respond immediately, waiting for me to continue. "He wanted forgiveness," I said, shaking my head. "But I told him no. I'm done with him, with all of them." Rachel reached over and took my hand, her touch warm and steady. "You did the right thing," she said softly. And for the first time in a long time, I truly believed her. When I walked into Rachel's bookstore that morning, the familiar smell of coffee and paper greeted me like an old friend. The place was buzzing, full of customers browsing shelves and chatting at small tables. It had become more than just a store. It was a hub of warmth and connection, a stark contrast to the cold isolation I once knew. Rachel was behind the counter, laughing with a regular customer. When she saw me, her face lit up in that way it always did, and for a moment, the chaos of the world faded. "Morning, Caleb," she called, sliding a freshly brewed cup of coffee across the counter. "Morning," I replied, taking a sip and letting the familiar bitterness ground me. It was moments like this that made me realize just how far I'd come. The tight-knit community Rachel had created in this little bookstore wasn't just hers anymore. It was ours. I had found a place here, a family that didn't rely on blood but on love, trust, and shared experiences. Over time, I'd taken on more responsibility at the store, helping Rachel with inventory, event planning, and even the occasional customer interaction. It wasn't just work, it was purpose. Watching her face light up when we hit a sales goal or successfully hosted a children's story hour was a kind of joy I hadn't known before. But it wasn't just Rachel. Her family had embraced me in a way that felt almost surreal. Her parents treated me like one of their own, inviting me to Sunday dinners and family outings. Her younger brother, Sam, had become a good friend, always quick with a joke or a word of encouragement. One weekend, we hosted a small gathering at the store, a celebration of Rachel's birthday. The place was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of homemade pastries from her mother. As I looked around at the smiling faces, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: belonging. Rachel's father, a quiet man with a kind demeanor, pulled me aside at one point. "You're good for her," he said simply, his eyes twinkling with warmth. "I think she's better for me," I replied, and we both laughed. The void left by my own family's betrayal was slowly being filled by these genuine connections. They didn't just accept me, they valued me. It was a stark contrast to the cold, manipulative dynamics I'd left behind. Even the bookstore regulars had become a kind of extended family. James, the retired teacher who always came in for mystery novels, would stay and chat for hours about everything from history to local gossip. Linda, the young mother who ran the local bakery, often brought over treats for the staff. These people didn't know the details of my past, but they didn't need to. All that mattered was the present. One evening, after a long day at the store, Rachel and I sat on the couch in our living room. She rested her head on my shoulder, and for a while, we just listened to the soft hum of the world outside. "Did you ever think life would look like this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought about her question, the weight of everything that had brought me here. "No," I admitted, "but I wouldn't trade it for anything." She smiled, her hand finding mine. "Me neither." The contrast between my old life and this one couldn't have been clearer. I had traded betrayal for trust, manipulation for support, and loneliness for love. For years, I had carried the weight of my family's rejection and Emily's betrayal, but now, surrounded by people who truly cared about me, I felt lighter. This new family, this community, it wasn't just a replacement for what I'd lost. It was better. Equals the email came out of nowhere. Its subject line was innocuous, just my name. But as soon as I saw who had sent it, my stomach tightened. It was from my mother. I hadn't heard from her, or anyone in my family, since I told Ethan to leave my life for good. Blocking their numbers had been a liberating decision, but it didn't prevent them from finding other ways to reach me. Against my better judgment, I opened it. "Caleb, we've been trying to reach you. Please, this is important. It's about Ethan. He's very sick, and we need your help. Love, Mom." I stared at the screen, the words blurring together as anger and frustration churned in my chest. It didn't take long for the second email to follow, this one from Ethan himself. "Caleb, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I don't know where else to turn. My kidneys are failing. The doctors say I need a transplant, and you're my best chance. Please, Caleb, I'm begging you. I don't expect forgiveness, but I'm asking for your help. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse pounding in my ears. After everything he'd done, he had the audacity to ask me for something as monumental as this? It was almost laughable. When Rachel got home from the bookstore that evening, she found me pacing the living room, my thoughts a whirlwind of anger and disbelief. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady and calm. I handed her the emails, too angry to form a coherent sentence. She read them quietly, her expression shifting from curiosity to disbelief. "They're unbelievable," she said finally, shaking her head. "After everything they've put you through, they think they can just ask this of you?" I sat down heavily on the couch, running a hand through my hair. "I don't even know how to process this," I admitted. Part of me wants to ignore it, to block them and move on. But a kidney transplant? That's life or death. Rachel placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "You don't owe them anything, Caleb. Not after what they've done. But whatever you decide, make sure it's for you, not for them." Her words stayed with me as I tried to sort through my feelings. The thought of helping Ethan, the man who had betrayed me in the worst possible way, made my blood boil. But there was a nagging voice in the back of my mind, a whisper of doubt. Could I live with myself if I didn't help him? After several sleepless nights, I finally responded to Ethan. My reply was short and to the point. "I'll get tested. That's all I'm willing to do. Don't expect anything more." The relief in his response was almost palpable, even through the screen. "Thank you, Caleb. I know I don't deserve this, but thank you." The testing process was quick but nerve-wracking. I tried not to think too much about the implications of being a match, focusing instead on the logistics. Rachel was by my side every step of the way, her quiet support a lifeline as I navigated the emotional turmoil. When the results came back, the doctor confirmed what I already suspected. I was a perfect match. Ethan's joy was immediate and overwhelming. He called, texted, and emailed repeatedly, thanking me and begging to meet in person to discuss the next steps. I ignored him, forwarding everything to Rachel to avoid the temptation to respond. "You've done what you said you would," Rachel reminded me. "Now it's up to you to decide how to proceed. But don't let them manipulate you, Caleb. They've had enough of your life already." I nodded, grateful for her clarity. Ethan and my parents tried to contact me again, pleading and pressuring me to commit to the surgery. But I wasn't ready to make a decision. Not yet. The weight of the situation loomed large, but one thing was clear. This was my choice and mine alone. The hospital smelled sterile and unwelcoming, its fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on everything they touched. It had been years since I'd been back in my hometown, and I'd hoped never to return. But here I was, walking through its cold corridors toward a confrontation I'd spent countless sleepless nights dreading. Rachel had offered to come with me, but I declined. This was something I needed to face alone. As much as I appreciated her unwavering support, I didn't want her to witness the inevitable chaos of this meeting. When I stepped into the waiting room where my family had gathered, the air grew heavier. My mother was the first to spot me, her face lighting up with a mixture of hope and relief. "Caleb, you came," she said, rushing forward to hug me. I didn't move, my arms stiff at my sides as she embraced me. "Don't read too much into it," I said coldly, stepping back. "I'm here because I said I would be, nothing more." My father stood nearby, his expression guarded, while Ethan sat in a wheelchair, looking frail and worn. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered the years of pain and betrayal he'd caused, and any sympathy I might have felt evaporated. "Caleb," Ethan said, his voice weak but filled with desperation. "Thank you for coming." I cut him off with a sharp glare. "Don't thank me. I haven't done anything yet." The room fell silent, tension crackling like electricity in the air. My mother cleared her throat, clearly uncomfortable. "We're all here because we're a family, Caleb. This is our chance to heal, to come back together." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Family? Is that what you call this?" Because from where I'm standing, it looks more like a collection of people who only care about me when they need something. "Caleb, that's not fair," my father said, his voice stern. "We've all made mistakes, but this is bigger than that. Ethan's life is at stake. And whose fault is that?" I shot back. Maybe if he'd spent less time ruining other people's lives, he wouldn't be in this situation. Ethan looked down, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. I know I don't deserve your help, he said quietly, but I'm begging you, Caleb. Please. I took a step closer, my voice low and steady. Do you even hear yourself? You destroyed my marriage. You destroyed our family. And now you want me to save your life as if none of that ever happened. Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, but I didn't let up. You didn't care about me when you were sleeping with my wife, I continued, my anger bubbling to the surface. You didn't care about me when you stood by and watched as everything I cared about fell apart. So tell me, Ethan, why should I care about you now? The room was deathly silent, the weight of my words hanging heavy in the air. My mother, always the mediator, stepped forward, her voice trembling. Caleb, we're asking you to find it in your heart to forgive, to move past the pain and do what's right. I turned to her, my gaze icy. Forgiveness isn't something you demand, Mom. It's something you earn. And as far as I'm concerned, none of you have earned it. Ethan's voice broke as he spoke again. I'm sorry, Caleb, for everything. I know I can't undo what I've done, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. Just please, don't let me die. For a brief moment, I let his words sink in. The vulnerability in his voice was real, and the fear in his eyes was undeniable. But it wasn't enough. I'll say this one last time, I said, my voice firm. I'm done with all of you. I'll live my life without you, just like I've been doing for years. You made your choices, and now you can live with the consequences. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room, ignoring the sound of my mother's sobs and Ethan's choked pleas. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, a strange sense of relief washed over me. For years, I'd carried the weight of their betrayal, the pain of their choices haunting my every step. But now, standing under the fading light of the sunset, I felt lighter. I had confronted my past and walked away from it on my terms. The drive home felt different this time. The heaviness that usually accompanied any thought of my family was gone. I had said everything that needed to be said, left nothing unsaid, and for the first time, I felt free. The hospital and everyone in it were firmly in my past now. A chapter one had finally closed. When I pulled into the driveway of our cozy home, Rachel was waiting for me on the porch. Her presence was like a lighthouse guiding me back to safety after the storm. She didn't ask questions or press for details, just offered a warm smile and open arms. You okay? She asked, her voice soft. I nodded, pulling her close. I am now. Inside, the familiarity of our life together wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. The quiet hum of the bookstore's coffee grinder echoed in my mind. A place filled with love, laughter, and purpose. This was my real family now, a life I had built from the ruins of betrayal. But first, there was one final step to take. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea in hand, and blocked every remaining contact from my family. Phone numbers, email addresses, social media profiles. If they wanted to find me again, they'd have to do it through extraordinary means. I composed one last email, sent to my mother, and copied to everyone else in the family. Mom, Dad, and Ethan, this will be the last time you hear from me. I have made my decision, and it's final. I won't be part of a family that values convenience over loyalty, manipulation over honesty. For years, I tried to make sense of what happened, but the truth is simple. You chose to betray me, and I choose not to forgive that. I wish you no harm, but I will no longer carry the burden of our shared history. I've built a life filled with people who love and respect me, and that's where my focus will remain. Do not contact me again. This is goodbye. Caleb. Hitting send felt like lifting the final weight off my shoulders. There was no going back now, no second-guessing. The ties were cut, and for the first time, I felt like I was finally in control of my own story. Rachel joined me at the table, setting her hand on mine. How does it feel? She asked, her eyes searching mine. I considered her question for a moment. Like I can finally breathe, I said. The next few days passed quietly, and I threw myself into the rhythm of our life. The bookstore was preparing for a big author event, and Rachel and I spent late nights planning every detail. The small community we built through the store felt like a lifeline, each customer and friend adding another thread to the fabric of our lives. One evening, as we locked up the store after another busy day, Rachel leaned against the counter and smiled at me. "You've come a long way, you know." "I had a lot of help," I replied, returning her smile. The following weekend, Rachel's family hosted a small gathering, and for the first time, I didn't feel like an outsider. Her parents treated me like their own. Her brother Sam joked with me as if we'd known each other for years, and her nieces and nephews swarmed me with laughter and questions about everything from books to soccer. This was what family was supposed to feel like: warm, supportive, and full of love. That night, as Rachel and I sat on the porch watching the stars, she rested her head on my shoulder. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked gently. I shook my head. "Not anymore. They're part of my past, and that's where they'll stay." "And how about your future?" she asked, a playful lilt in her voice. I smiled, wrapping an arm around her. "It's sitting right here next to me." For years, I'd carried the pain of betrayal, letting it shape my choices and define my life. But now, as I looked at the woman beside me and the life we'd built together, I realized something important. Cutting ties with my past wasn't an act of anger or revenge. It was an act of self-love. I had chosen peace, and for the first time in my life, it felt like I had truly found it. The morning light streamed through the windows of our home, soft and golden, painting the walls with warmth. It was a far cry from the cold, sterile rooms I'd left behind in my old life. As I stood in the kitchen, sipping my coffee and watching Rachel flip pancakes for breakfast, I couldn't help but marvel at how far I'd come. Years ago, I couldn't have imagined this kind of peace. Back then, my days were consumed by the pain of betrayal, my nights haunted by memories of what I'd lost. But now, that pain felt like a distant echo, something I could acknowledge without letting it define me. Rachel glanced over her shoulder, catching me lost in thought. "What's that look for?" she teased, her smile bright and effortless. "Just thinking," I said, setting my coffee down, "about how lucky I am." She laughed, a sound that never failed to lift my spirits. "Well, don't get too comfortable. These pancakes don't flip themselves." I joined her at the stove, taking over the task as we fell into an easy rhythm. This was what life had become: simple, joyful, and full of shared moments that reminded me of what truly mattered. Later that day, we headed to the bookstore, where the shelves were lined with new arrivals and the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. The store had become more than just a business. It was a reflection of the life Rachel and I had built together. It wasn't unusual for customers to linger, drawn in by the warmth of the space and the sense of community we'd nurtured. James, one of our regulars, stopped by with a basket of homemade muffins. "Thought you two could use a little pick-me-up," he said with a grin. "Thanks, James," Rachel said, beaming. As I watched her chat with him, her laugh lighting up the room, I felt a pang of gratitude so profound it almost took my breath away. Rachel had been my anchor through everything, her unwavering support pulling me out of the darkest moments of my life. In the afternoon, a group of children gathered in the corner for story time, their laughter filling the store as Rachel read aloud from one of their favorite books. I couldn't help but smile as I watched her interact with them, her warmth and kindness shining through in every word. This was my life now, a far cry from the chaos and betrayal that once defined it. That evening, as we sat on the porch watching the stars, Rachel rested her head on my shoulder. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with curiosity. "Not anymore," I said, meaning it. "They're part of the past. I gestured to the life around us, the quiet peace of the night. This is my future." She smiled, her hand finding mine. "I'm glad you see it that way. You deserve every bit of this happiness, Caleb." In that moment, I realized just how far I'd come. The betrayal and heartbreak that once consumed me no longer held any power. I had reclaimed my life, choosing to fill it with love, trust, and the kind of joy that comes from truly letting go. Rachel and I had plans for the future, expanding the bookstore, traveling to places we'd always dreamed of, and maybe even starting a family of our own. For the first time in years, I felt like the possibilities were endless. As we sat there, Wrapped in the quiet comfort of each other's presence, I knew one thing for certain. I had finally found my peace. The life I had reclaimed wasn't just about moving on from the pain. It was about creating something better, something worth holding on to. And for the first time, I was ready to embrace it all.